Today we have Mark Licht, Associate Professor and Extension Cropping Specialist over in the Agronomy Department at Iowa State. I think one of the things we've heard pretty frequently is that reaching scale, economy of scale, might be a struggle for anaerobic digesters in Iowa. So we have to start thinking about what are some other opportunities for materials we might be able to add. So we asked Mark to talk about what's the potential of cover crop biomass and what that might look like integrating into the production systems we have. So really excited for him to share his perspective today and some of the work he's been doing on cover crops to maybe make this feasible in the future. So with that, thanks, Mark, for joining us today, and excited to hear what you have to say.
Yeah, Dan, thanks for having me. So I'm going to take the liberty of actually changing my title in true extension format. And Dan, this will come to no surprise to Dan or some of the others that have been working in this space a little bit, because I view cover crops differently than some other people. So I would not actually call these cover crops. I would, you know, strategically change the title to winter biomass crops or winter small grain crops. And largely because really we're not talking about a cover crop here. We're really talking about, I'll say, a cash crop. And so, and I wanted to distinguish that because you'll see in a few more slides here that we're really not managing cover crops. I mean, we get them seeded, we hope they grow. If they don't grow, we throw up our hands and we complain and we move on. But if we're talking about a winter biomass crop or a winter small grain crop that we want to get biomass out of and feed into a digester, I'm going to argue that we probably need to manage that as a cash crop of sorts. And so there will be some things that I will point out, and I guess that makes me think about this a little bit differently than I would as using it as a cover crop, I guess. So yes, I'm going to use winter small grains. So kind of what are we talking about here? And I'm going to use the term winter small grains. I know there's others that are using winter biomass crops, but really what we're talking about is trying to grow these and harvest for that vegetative biomass. And the other part of this is, we're going to try to get the renewable energy benefits of this out of this as well. And then the third part of this, and this is where I think the cover crop aspect does come in. We can still enhance our soil health. We can prevent that erosion. We can pull up nutrients at times of the year when traditionally we don't have anything growing, right? So we're susceptible to water runoff and erosion. We're susceptible to nitrogen leaching, right? And so these winter small grains really do help us there still. It's just, yes, we are going to want to fertilize them. We're going to want to follow some other practices that would lead us to some higher biomass production. Generally speaking, we're going to be talking about winter wheat, cereal rye, also sometimes called winter rye, and then winter triticale. These are kind of the three most common small grains that are going to overwinter in Iowa. By far and above, the cereal rye is going to be our higher biomass producing of the three. Winter triticale is probably right behind it or fairly close behind it. Winter wheat, unless you're looking at a forage variety, the plant breeders have done a really good job of trying to breed it to be shorter, less biomass, more grain. And so winter wheat's probably not going to put out as much biomass in a lot of cases, like we would want. I've been asked before, why don't we think about or talk about spring oats, wheat, triticale, barley? Again, they're not going to produce as much biomass as quickly as the winter types. So that's kind of a detriment. The quickly part's probably where that comes in. We can get with these overwintering types, we can get a 3 to 4 week jump on biomass growth and production. And so that's part of what's going on here. Also, the spring oats or the spring varieties, we're not going to get the fall cover crop living root benefit that we get with these overwintering types. And so we just have to kind of keep that in mind as we look forward to it. Not that we can't use the spring types of small grains. they're just not going to get to that same biomass level, and they're not going to get there as quickly. Um, Cereal rye and winter triticale are going to be our most cold hardy. They're going to more than likely overwinter the best in Iowa. Barleys are not going to overwinter quite as well unless you're kind of up in the northern part of the state. Whereas like winter wheat, it's going to do better in the southern part of the state than as compared to the northern part. So just have to kind of think through those things a little bit when we look at the different winter small grains that could be placed into this type of a system. So I'm going to jump into kind of how do we maybe want to look at this and manage this. And so the first thing that I kind of thought about was the crop rotational aspect of it. And so if we think about this as a 3 harvests in 2 years mentality, where the winter small grain is going to be drill seeded following that corn harvest, and then the second year, the soybeans get planted after that winter small grain biomass is harvested. So in that second year is when we really get the 2 harvests, but it's a three crop 2-year rotation still. And this is going to come as a surprise to many of you, I'm sure, right? This is what I just described as double crop soybean system. And so how many people have been double cropping soybeans in Iowa? Very few. I would venture a guess that we're less than 50,000 acres of double crop soybeans in the state. And there's reasons for that. Although about, 4 or 5 years ago, the USDA has allowed some changes in the insurance programs that do now allow double crop soybeans in Iowa. And there is some growing interest because of that. Okay, so thinking about it from this double crop perspective, then I jump down and I start to think about what considerations do we have for that corn cash crop. So I start with silage corn or seed production acres because, quite honestly, this is the easiest way to get it in there. Those are harvested early. A lot of times, we'll be seeing that harvest starting in late August, early to mid-September. So you can get a small grain seeded and get really good establishment and growth in the fall, right? So this is kind of, I'll call it the no-brainer option as where to start, if you have this as a potential to go with. Okay, if we're looking at like a commodity corn production where we're harvesting for grain, now we're typically going to have to think about, do we want to maybe on select acres switch to a slightly earlier maturing hybrid? And this, what I'm really looking at here is, can we move our harvest to either late September, early October to facilitate timely seeding or planting of that small grain? And we want to typically be doing that kind of in the mid-October timeframe, maybe even early October as well, right? So we can maybe do that on select acres. I don't think we want to do that across the board. And the reason I say we don't probably want to do that across the board is traditionally the later maturing hybrids tend to be higher yielding just simply because we're using a longer portion of the growing season. And so when we look at, maybe in this situation for those early maturing hybrids, we may be looking for some that are exceptionally high yielding, but they may have other trade-offs with them. So there's opportunities here anyhow, at least to consider. As I flip the calendar to spring, then I kind of think about the soybeans, and how do we maybe manage soybeans following a winter small grain? I'm going to say the same maturity selection. So if you're used to planting a maturity group 2.5 or a 2.0, then stay with that same maturity selection. And possibly, if you have confidence in your fall, you might go with a half maturity to a full maturity group longer. Idea here is if you have a late frost like we do this year, now you can actually gain some grain fill period and increase your yield on those double crop soybeans. So that's kind of a strategy to kind of think of. There's some risk management in it. Obviously, if you frost off your soybeans, that can take back some of that yield potential that you were hoping to get. The second part of that is just because now we're looking about getting into a later planting period. we start recommending to find a way to get into narrower row spacing. So 15 inches or less. I know I hear a lot when I say, find a way to plant 15-inch rows, but then I only have a 30-inch planter. The easy way to do it is you just double plant at 60% seeding rate. So you're going to get two passes across there to kind of fill in that basically the field area, right? Trying to capture as much sunlight as you can and have as little sunlight hitting the soil surface as quickly as possible. And then, of course, drill seeding is a good way to do it as well. We do have to make sure with drill seeding that we have enough weight and we have the depth set right so that we're getting that seed into moisture. So this is getting into a time of year where we can be fairly dry. And so having moisture in that top inch or two could be a detriment. So, and then the third part of this is increase the seeding rate by 10 to 20%. Again, what we're really looking at is trying to basically capture as much sunlight as quickly as we can. And so when we increase our seeding rates on soybeans, it forces them to branch out a little bit and basically push their branches out into that inner row space. So, good agronomics would say if we get into I'll say late May, early June timeframe, that's when we're going to want to look at, some of these strategies, to really close canopy as quickly as we possibly can. Okay, so now I'm going to go backwards just a little bit and really talk about the winter small grain considerations, because I think, we can talk about this kind of outside of the crop rotation in some respects. Okay, so again, I really look at winter small grains as not necessarily being cover crops. And because they're not cover crops and we want to get some value out of them, we need to, kind of make sure we treat them as if they're that cash crop. So that's where some of these recommendations are going to start coming into play. So as far as cereal rye and triticale and wheat, we can get some really good biomass out of these. And my estimates, if anything, are maybe a little bit conservative. I know that there are people that have told me that they get more cereal rye or they get more triticale than what I've got on the slide here. But I think these are pretty good numbers to kind of consider year in and year out. And if we're managing for tonnage, we're probably going to be closer to the upper end of what I have. So 3 to 5 tons or 3 to 4 tons per acre on the cereal rye or triticale. Okay. And so how do we get there? Early planting is how we get there, quite honestly, as part of this, right? So this early planting is going to be that late September, early October, maybe as late as mid-October. The earlier we get it planted, the lower the seeding rates that we can go to. And it all comes into, in the fall is when they produce these tillers, right? And so those tillers are what's going to give us that biomass. Okay. And so if we can get them planted earlier, we'll get more tillers, which means I am able to put out less seed is the easiest way to kind of say that. So traditionally, if we're producing small grains for grain production or seed production, we're going to be looking at 1 to 1.5 million seeds per acre. If we get planted on the early side of kind of that planting window, I think we can go down to 1 million seeds pretty easily. If we're pushing mid-October or late October, we probably need to go to 1.5 million seeds per acre. Okay. And I know, I'm talking, a little bit in, I'll say different terms, because we're used to seeding cover crops in bushels per acre, right? So we really have to sit back and look at the seed tag when it comes, when you get that seed or when you're ordering the seed, sometimes they'll know the seed size already. And then that will be an easy way to make that quick calculation, your seed size, divide it through based on your seeding rate. And then that'll tell you how many pound or how many 50-pound bags essentially of the seed that you're going to need. The next aspect of this is fertilization. So quite honestly, our small grains, they're grasses. If we want biomass out of them, we've got to add nitrogen fertilizer. Okay. Um, Wheat, it's been bred. Obviously, it's a higher protein grain, but it's been bred to kind of respond to nitrogen rates a little bit more, and so it has a higher nitrogen rate need. Cereal rye and triticale are a little bit lower, and part of that's just it has a little bit lower need, but the other part is if you really feed nitrogen to cereal rye, it will almost undoubtedly lodge over on you and make harvesting a little bit more challenging. So don't want to necessarily over fertilize the nitrogen on cereal rye. Wheat can take a little bit more. The other aspect of this is not to forget about uh, the phosphorus fertilizer. Okay, so um, there's a couple things that come through for small grains. The phosphorus is known to help us produce more tillers. It's been known to help the plant overwinter a little bit more successfully. So we do want to make sure that we have plenty of phosphorus out there, basically really looking to make sure that the soil tests are not limited. And in some cases, we can maybe even think about looking for a response to starter fertilizers in some of these soils. And so obviously in the low, very low testing soils, there's going to be a little bit greater response to starter fertilizer or starter phosphorus. But we can start to see that in some of the higher production areas where we want maybe to put a little starter on just to give us a little bit more of a boost there. I should also talk a little bit with both nitrogen and phosphorus about the timing of this fertilization. So with the phosphorus, putting it out in the fall is okay. Ideally we'd want to maybe seed it and then get it on fairly quickly after seeding, or maybe even if we're lucky enough to be able to get it, the phosphorus fertilizer put out there ahead of the seeding as well. The nitrogen is a little bit different. Here, you can get some benefits basically in that fall growth by having a little bit of nitrogen applied out in the fall. But where you're really going to see the nitrogen fertilizer give you returns on the biomass production is in the springtime, kind of that top dress time frame, as it's coming out of dormancy before it really puts up jointed stems. That's when you're really going to see the nitrogen fertilizer really provide those benefits. Okay. Another aspect of fertilization that we should, or at least I should mention, is potassium and sulfur. From a small grains perspective, I'm not overly concerned as long as we have adequate soil tests for the potassium. We do occasionally, if we're in the spring of the year, we might see some sulfur benefits on, like a cereal rye or a winter wheat. But where I'm really more concerned about the potassium and the sulfur is making sure that we have enough available for the soybeans that would be double cropped afterwards. Soybeans are they're going to take up more potassium anyhow, and so I'd really hate to harvest off all that biomass and then not have enough potassium there for that following soybean crop. So we just have to kind of look at that and consider that a little bit. And I apologize because I see that I got a couple slides that bounced out of place on me at some point in my process, but there is a balance between the winter small grain and the soybean production. And so this schematic is really just kind of starting to address that. That small grain, in this case, I just say cereal rye, it's going to start to green up really as soon as we start to get 30 degree or above freezing weather, right? So we get into the mid 30s, low 40s, that cereal rye is going to green up really quickly and it'll start putting on biomass. And so if we go back and look at some of the even just looking at cover crop biomass in the spring of 2024 when it was green in early March, we had probably 4 to 5 tons of biomass in some of these fields before we could get them terminated. Now, if we flip the calendar to 2025, we didn't green up. We didn't get warm enough temperatures to get the cereal rye to come out of dormancy until early April. And so trying to, hold off of terminating that cover crop before corn or soybean planting was a little bit harder. And so there's the kind of the spring weather that's going to play into this a little bit. I don't know exactly, where this balance point is. I think it's going to be a little bit different for each farmer. How far do they want to push that biomass production? How late they want to push it, because that's going to have an impact on the soybean production. Okay. And so this slide here just kind of shows a little bit about how the cereal rye biomass is really driven by growing degree units. And how we calculate them for cereal rye is a little bit different than we do for corn. So cereal rye, we're looking at accumulation of heat units from July 1, or excuse me, not July 1, January 1. And we're looking at essentially anything above 32 degrees as a kind of a cardinal low temperature. So that's, again, kind of comes into play where when do these start to green up? Is it going to be in early March? Is it going to be mid-March? Or is it going to be in April? And so we do have some indications of how quickly we can get to, some decent biomass production. Helping us think about this balance between the winter small grain and the soybean, I am much more confident in this chart. And largely, what we're showing here is that after May 20th, that's when we start to see yield penalties from late planting. Okay. Before that, there's enough, I'll say, variability from year to year. But after that, and this goes back, looking at some of those references, this goes back to research data clear back into the late 1970s, right? And so we can start to balance this a little bit, right? So we can still have, planting soybeans on, mid-June, we'll still have potentially 80% yield potential. Again, how does that pencil out economically? And are you getting if you're losing 20% of your soybean, yield potential, did you economically gain that from the biomass production? And so that's the key that we have to kind of hone in on and start balancing with. Okay. The other thing that comes into play when I think about double cropping, and I've done some relay cropping here in the last couple of years, and this comes into play with intercropping as well, is the growing season rainfall and soil moisture. The winter small grain, they do a really good job of utilizing moisture, right? They pull moisture out of the topsoil. As they get more mature, those roots are deeper, so they start pulling moisture from deeper down. So we have to be careful of what is this balance looking like. And this may actually dictate, maybe, harvesting biomass earlier than we normally would if the spring is drier than we think it is, or normally would be, right? The other thing to kind of consider is because that winter small grain is out there all of winter long and into the spring, it gets the water first. And so soybeans are only going to get what is left. And so I've planted soybeans in mid-June and only had about 20% of my soybean yield potential because they just did not have enough soil moisture. They didn't get enough rainfall that last part of June and into July or even August to be able to do much. So we have to maybe be flexible in kind of how we're managing this, how we want to manage that small grain biomass versus the soybean yield. It may be that we, kind of follow the weather, and if everything looks dry and if there's indications for continued dry weather, maybe we do. Maybe we terminate that cereal rye as a cover crop and plant soybeans more timely in early May. Or maybe we, just say, well, okay, we're going to go after this small grain biomass, and we don't even worry about double crop planting the soybeans. So there's a couple decision points that have to be made to really think about how we, kind of factor in rainfall and soil moisture into this equation to make sure that we're able to make kind of the right decisions on it. Now I'm going to throw something else out from a crop rotation standpoint, more of an alternative crop rotation. And so here I'm thinking about 3 years, but now bumping that up to the 5 harvests in 3 years, just as a way of getting more biomass. And so if we're able to, or if we need or have the ability to take some of that biomass a little bit later into the summer, this would provide another option. So again, just like in the first scenario, we could do a winter small grain, and drill seed that following a soybean harvest. In this case, is where I'm going with it. And then once we harvest that winter small grain, then we could come in with a warm season annual. So we could come in with a millet or a sorghum or a Sudan, something like that, and get 5 to 10 or more tons per acre off. And then either let it kind of winter kill or maybe plant a winter kill cover crop in the fall. And then do some small grain drilling in that third year following corn harvest. So using that third year kind of to reset, where we do the corn harvest, do the winter small grain, come back with soybeans, kind of like the year one would. So there's this option that we could potentially get, a biomass. I'll call it a biomass year, where we have kind of a winter small grain biomass, come right in with a warm season annual to get a lot more tonnage. Then flip to kind of our corn soybean rotation for a couple of years there as well. So another alternative, kind of thinking about how do we get the tonnage that we potentially need. So with that, I have kind of reached the end of my slides. So I would ask, kind of what questions, are coming in, Dan, or do you need to do some promotional too?
Yeah, we'll do my promotional and then I'll ask you questions that both
Okay.
came in and that I generated while you were talking. All right. Next month on November 11th, I get to give the webinar, and we're just going to go back to the basics. We're going to look at biochemical methane potential and anaerobic toxicity assays and how they help us explore material choices and really how to interpret those and what they mean. So excited to do that one. Hopefully, it'll be a nice detailed and maybe answer some of the questions of what is harvest timing due to the potential gas production? Because Mark said chase tonnage, and sometimes that's true, but sometimes that impacts digestibility. And I think it's important for us to think about that portion of it too, especially as a guy who hauls manure water around. Sometimes I don't want to haul water around. I want to haul around the parts that I'm going to use. We do put all these on our YouTube channel. So if you or a friend missed what we talked about today and want to see it in the near future, we'll get that posted on our Dr. Manure account on YouTube. And then we do post all our presentation slides in a SciBox that you can visit to download if you need those as a resource to refer to. And then finally, we do send out an anaerobic digestion newsletter. It will come out next month. I promise that we only send 4 a year, so they're quarterly. If you want to sign up, I'll give you just a moment to scan that QR code. All right, and we'll assume that that moment passed. So we're in good shape. All right, the first question we got for you, Mark, is you talked a little bit about fertility for that small grain, and this question came before that, but they were interested in spray irrigating with swine manure onto the winter crop. And I'm a little interested in what you'd say too. I think I've normally seen it in the spring, but you told me I want to get some phosphorus maybe out in the fall. How should we think about maybe having to manage manure digester effluent onto some of these small grains?
I was going to defer that one to you, Dan. You probably have a little bit more experience than I do, from that perspective. I would say though, if that winter small grain is actively growing, it will utilize that manure nutrient source, right? So I know that when I've seen it's been injected, the cover crops right above that do really well. They're nice and tall and vibrant, right? Now, obviously, where we want to get tonnage off this, we probably don't want to be doing the injected into it, because that will, be a detriment to the, plant stand, so to speak, right? And so I do think that, the winter small grain will utilize it. I think also if you're putting on, a large amount, I don't know if it's going to use all of it, right? And so then I get concerned about, okay, does that set us up for losses in the spring? And how do I want to maybe look at that as well?
Great points. So most people who do manure onto small grains in the states where they grow small grains, it is surface applied in the spring, like Mark said, and I think that's important. Remember, if you have to fill out a manure management plan, your ability to put on nutrients for this crop is dependent on your decision to harvest it. So in order to harvest, if you're going to harvest your cash crop now, you can put it in your manure plan and you are allowed to put on at up to removal rate, essentially. Iowa DNR has a standard for what they'd let you put on for silages. So make sure you're putting that on. If you're historically high soil phosphorus test with manure, I might worry a little bit less about putting my phosphorus on in the fall. If you are managing to minimum phosphorus for some reason, you're a brand new swine farm and have super nitrogen rich manure and not phosphorus, you might be able to think about putting a little starter phosphorus on for that cash crop to make sure we do get good tillering and as good a growth as possible. I thought it was great, and I learned enough that I might feel willing to try it from what Mark said. So I feel better than I felt before this. All right, so we have another question for you. In a biomass year, so this is referring to your when you showed us that longer term rotation, thinking a little bit more outside the box. Super
Mhm.
exciting. Uh, Winter small grain followed by sorghum. What are you doing for weed control, pest carryover? Is there any concern there for crops in the future?
Yeah, so there could be, right? If you're putting out a sorghum in particular, I'd be more concerned about corn the following year, right? We just know that there's some pest carryover with that. Although generally speaking, it's going to be the pests that I get worried about are some of those that migrate in as
Mhm.
well, and so I don't get as worried about some of those. Obviously, corn rootworm is not going to be I shouldn't maybe say obviously. Corn rootworm is not a pest that we're going to see in say some of those summer annuals. So I'm not really worried about those. Where I do maybe get a little bit more worried about some of the carryover is that again, corn's a grass. These summer annuals that I mentioned are grasses, so there could be some disease pathogens that would carry through. So we just have to be cognizant of that. Unfortunately, I don't know enough in that area to really point out okay which species and which pathogens. I'd have to do a little bit of recon and literature review to find those.
And that's Allison Robinson talks about the Green Bridge a little bit there, right?
Yeah.
So
Yep.
refer to her stuff if you really want to know more of that. Since that question sort of asked it in the negative way, is there any positive to sort of breaking up that corn soybean cycle for disease, pressure, weed control that you can think of?
Yeah, and I actually view this more on the soybean side.
Hmm.
Getting a kind of getting a little bit more time, I'll say, between soybean production, I think actually helps. We break down some additional residue. Some of the soil-borne pathogens just become a little less prevalent, and so we can get a little bit of benefit there. On the corn side, I don't think we're necessarily going to see that as much. Well, maybe the benefit there is, yeah, again, we're going to be pulling off biomass, so we're not going to have as much carryover residue that would potentially immobilize nitrogen on us.
Hmm.
And so, from a corn perspective, there could be a little bit of benefit. I think overall, the system is going to have a little bit higher soil health benefits coming out of it, breaking up compaction, just putting in some roots, building some organic matter, things like that.
Hmm. Especially letting those cereal grains grow a little bit more, the root development is certainly proportional to that.
Yeah. Yep.
All right. We have another question. Do you have any insights on the variability in the growth phase of cereal rye when it's due to be harvested based on the weather or growing degree days? What takes it to boot, heading, or other?
Oh, no, this one I would struggle with. I mean, I can dive in a little bit, but just trying to basically what you're asking is predicting out, how many heat units to boot, how many heat units
Hmm.
to heading, things like that. I'd have to dig a little bit deeper to that. The other challenge that I would have is the maturity of some of the varieties that you have. So you can get some early maturing varieties, mid, late maturing varieties, and that'll shift that around a little bit. The other aspect that we maybe need to consider too is typically the forage varieties are going to be some of our, well, we would expect them to be our higher tonnage.
Mhm.
Not always, but we would expect them to be. And so that could throw a little bit of a wrinkle into it as well.
And you did show some nice growing degree day data, and it was relatively predictive of rye biomass, at least in that year or multiple years there.
Yeah, so that was multiple years, multiple trials. And so I should maybe be put a little preface around that, be a little cautious around that. So that was actually cover crop, so not managed well, right?
Mhm.
Small cereal rye that wasn't managed for production, right? So I actually think that those numbers would be a little bit on the conservative side. I think they're going to, if you fertilize it, you manage it well, you're going to get more biomass a little bit quicker than even that figure showed.
Perfect. And I mean, at least it shows the potential for estimating biomass accumulation based on, so you can think about how it fits in a cropping system. And I thought that was
Yes,
super useful.
yes.
All right, now I get to ask an off the wall question. I know you've been doing some work on relay cropping. Any chance that I could plant my soybean, and how many days can I gain if I plant it and then try and harvest my rye?
You're actually going to lose days if you're going to
Okay.
relay crop and try to harvest rye for biomass.
Hmm.
Because as soon as what your soybeans have to be shorter than your cut height, right? Because
Yeah.
otherwise you're gonna clip them and then you're gonna lose that soybean production, right? And so from a winter biomass production, I do think probably the double crop system is going to be better, and simply because if you delay planting of your soybean to be able to get the height differences that you need to intercrop, for what you're really going to lose is the wheel tracks through the field, and then you're going to actually end up with lower biomass
Yeah.
harvest than you normally want. And so
Yep.
there's a pretty big trade-off on that one that we have to be careful about.
All right. And then you mentioned some ideas about the corn portion of the system, looking for maybe those seed corn acres where they come off earlier, corn silage. And while we don't have a lot of this, there are some cattle farms that take off high moisture corn. Same idea, right?
Yes, same
Yeah.
idea. That would be some of our more earlier harvested, right? Maybe not as
Mhm.
early as silage or maybe not as early as seed corn. But again, yeah, same principle, being able to get in there a little bit earlier.
And then I just wanted to follow up on one other thing you said. So I think we see a lot more people fertilizing soybeans now than we used to, but it used to be sort of a system where we fertilize corn and soybeans got the carryover. If we're going to start putting a third crop in the middle, do we go away from that system and sort of say we have to think about fertility at each step along the way?
I think we would really want to, right? Or at least be able to plan for it a little bit more appropriately, right? And I really think that a soil fertility program, you have to know what's in your soil, to really be able to know what you need to put out there. At the same point, this is a change in that system, and so if we're pulling off 4 ton, 5 ton of biomass, now we've pulled out nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium. And for soybeans, I'm not overly worried about the nitrogen.
Hmm.
I'm more worried about the phosphorus and potassium, and just recognizing that we've changed that dynamic a little bit, right? And so again, if you're in the very low testing categories, maybe even the optimal testing category, I would still go out there and try to put out a removal rate for that rye biomass for the soybeans,
Hmm.
and hope that you're not shorting yourself too much.
Yeah. So you're saying there is still potentially hope that you could maybe think about it as an overall system, but at least in the short term, manage for each crop a little bit more appropriately to make sure you don't run short.
Yeah.
Hmm.
Yep.
All right, that took us to the end of the questions, but I did want to say a huge thank you. I felt like I learned a lot, and there was some great ideas about really looking at managing an agronomic system differently overall. But I wanted to give you the chance for the last word if you wanted it.
Oh, this is fun. I think it's a great opportunity to think about how do we, in some cases, this is intensifying the crop production system, but we're doing it in kind of a sustainable way.
Hmm.
And so I think that that's something that I'm really excited about, because we can start to think about, again, you started me out with cover crops, and I moved us away from them, but now I'm going to move us back, right? Because we're going to get the benefits of those cover crops through that small grain production in the fall and the spring. And so I think that really is a benefit of being able to intensify in this type of a manner.
Hmm. Perfect. Thanks so much, Mark, and thanks for everyone for joining us. Hopefully, we'll see you again on November 11th.